When I was 16, I got myself a boyfriend. So many stories begin this way. And he was the person who took me for a walk on the Brooklyn Bridge. I was struck with wonder by its beauty, and I wondered, how did it get there? Who built it? Why was it there? And when I started to read about it, I encountered the voice of its chief engineer, Washington Roebling, and I felt that Washington wanted me to tell his story. Washington Roebling's father was a very famous engineer, a man called John Roebling. And it was John Roebling, not Washington Roebling, who was hired to build the Brooklyn Bridge. But in 1869, John Roebling died, was killed in an accident, and Washington took over the building of the bridge. He was only 32 years old at the time. He had fought very courageously in the American Civil War. And the interesting thing about this story is many people thought that Washington Roebling was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. But what they didn't know was that John Roebling was, by Washington's account, an abusive tyrant as a father. So his background was a difficult one. It was at the cutting edge of technology when it opened. It was the first suspension bridge built with cables made of steel. The foundations of the towers were built using caissons. A caisson is launched like a ship from a dock. It's towed out to where it belongs, where the tower is going to sit in the river. It sinks, and then compressed air is pumped into it, down through shafts to keep the water out, and men go down into the caisson and they dig out down as far as the bedrock so that the tower can rest safely on the river's bed. This was really novel and dangerous work at the time, and one of the chief difficulties was that no one knew the dangers of working in compressed air. Washington Roebling and quite a few of the men who were working for him became very ill with the bends, decompression sickness. In those days, it was called caisson disease, and no one knew what caused it, but it can cause terrible pain, paralysis, and sometimes death. By 1875, he was so sick that he could not go down to the work site anymore. When he got very sick, he called on the assistance of one remarkable person, his wife, Emily Warren Roebling. She was a very brilliant woman. She had been very well educated. He could no longer read or write. He could hear and he could talk, but she began to take his dictation, and she would go down to the bridge site and talk to the other engineers. She would meet with the trustees, and she would carry out his instructions, and she would help him all through the final years of the construction of the bridge. Towards the end of the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, Washington and Emily Roebling lived at a house at 110 Columbia Heights. The house is gone now, but you can get a sense of how well Washington Roebling would have been able to see the work going on at the bridge. He was still ill, but he could see that work through a telescope looking out of his window down to the towers and the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge was completed in 1883. It opened to enormous fanfare in May of 1883, and in 1898, Brooklyn and New York were joined into one city. Up until that point, Brooklyn and Manhattan had been two separate cities, and certainly the Brooklyn Bridge played a very important role in the creation of Greater New York and the progress of the city. Washington Roebling's story has been a very inspiring story to me. He was not a man who had an easy life. He was a man who never gave up. No matter what challenge was put in front of him, he would face it, and he would find a way to get through it. And I think we all face challenges like that at one point or another. And learning the story of a person who did that, we want to find these stories that inspire us and keep us going. And Washington Roebling's story has been that kind of story for me, and by telling it, I hope that other people will be inspired by it too.